Hello and welcome to the Streaming Horror Movies Podcast, episode number 2. I'm your host, Rick Hunter, and as we did with episode 1, we're going to present a brief overview of 3 superb horror movies currently available on either streaming services or on-demand cable. And this week, the scary movies up for discussion are Us, The Autopsy of Jane Doe, and Midsommar. My intent with the bi-weekly podcast is to serve as a guide to the very best horror movies out there right now because, as I'm sure you're aware, it can be quite time-consuming to wade through the offerings on the various streaming outlets. Also, in these podcasts, we're going to give you a quick plot synopsis and a few general thoughts I have about the movies without overanalyzing them. So at least for now, the Streaming Horror Movies podcast episodes will be no more than 10 minutes in length and usually less than that. Sound cool? So first up is the movie entitled Us, which came out last year and was directed by Jordan Peele. At the beginning of the film, a young girl experiences a bizarre incident at a beachside carnival, and years later, that same little girl, now a grown woman, and her family go on vacation at the same beach. And on their first night there, they see 4 people standing out in the front yard, just silently standing there staring at them and not responding to the husband's demand to explain their presence on the property. The strangers end up forcibly entering the family's house, and the family realizes these violent home invaders are their own doppelgangers, and it all gets stranger from there. Directed by Jordan Peele, the comedian-turned-horror film director, I found this film overall to be one of the creepiest movies I watched last year, or maybe the last couple of years, and for fans of such films as The Strangers and the old series The Twilight Zone, this seemed to be a modern-day Twilight Zone on steroids. One criticism, however, I have is that the character who was the doppelganger of the mother, with her scrapey laryngitis voice, it made it kind of difficult to understand what she was saying, particularly in one scene where she was offering some explanation of what their purpose was. Otherwise, I enjoyed the film and do recommend it. The ending will be subject to interpretation, I guess you could say. The movie Us is on HBO on demand through February 17th, so be sure and catch it while you can if you're a subscriber to HBO. Next up, The Autopsy of Jane Doe, which is about a father and son coroner team. They begin working on the autopsy of a young woman that's been brought in by police that they found buried under an old house in which they were doing an investigation of a murder scene and happened to find this body under the house in the basement. As they proceed with the autopsy of this unidentified woman, unusual things are discovered during the autopsy, and then some really weird things starts happening, and the movie goes from there. To give away any more about the plot itself would give too much away, but I can say this movie creeped me out. The 2 main actors, Brian Cox and Emil Hirsch, are well cast in their roles as father and son coroners, and I wish there were more films with a creep factor quality as high as this one. This is somewhat of a rare modern-day horror movie in that it invites multiple viewings, and I highly recommend it, of course, and it is now streaming on Netflix. That's The Autopsy of Jane Doe. And the last movie we're discussing on episode 2 of the Streaming Horror Movies podcast is Midsommar. This movie came out last year, 2019, and is from the director Ari Aster that brought you the psychological film Hereditary. Midsommar tells the story of a young man who, at the suggestion of his Swedish friend, decides to visit Sweden's 90-year cultural event known as Midsummer. And the young man's girlfriend, who just lost her parents in a tragic accident, she reluctantly agrees to go along with him, as do a couple of his other friends. Upon arrival in the remote and absolutely gorgeous Swedish countryside where the event takes place, the American friends are warmly welcomed by a large commune of Swedes ranging in age from children to seniors. From this point on is when the story takes off and keeps you watching for its nearly 2.5-hour duration. I have to tell you, I'm more of a 90-minute movie kind of guy, but watching this film, the 2.5 hours didn't feel like it was that long. If you were a fan of Hereditary, you may also really like Midsommar, although to me this film took the strangeness of Hereditary and ramped it up times 10. It's got some graphically shocking scenes, some really bizarre WTF scenes, so this is not a film you would want young children to see, not at all. I think this is a film most people will either love or hate, and it's possible it could become a cult film over time. I noticed that the average Amazon rating is 3.5 stars, but I think this film deserves more like 4.5, as it was well acted and well directed. It's a psychologically mind-blowing horror film, to sum it all up, and that is Midsummer, and currently playing on Amazon Prime. So to recap the 3 horror films I'm recommending this week: Us, The Autopsy of Jane Doe, and Midsommar. Check them out, and be sure to recommend the Streaming Horror Movies podcast to your scary movie-loving friends. Have a great week.